Hello, and thank you for watching this presentation. First, let me quickly introduce myself. I am Dr. Eloïse Bertrand. I am an early career fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies and the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. I have recently defended my PhD thesis, which focuses on the role of opposition parties in hybrid regimes, focusing on Burkina Faso and Uganda. The paper I am discussing here is deriving from my doctoral research, and I'm about to submit it to a journal, so I welcome any feedback to ensure it is as good as possible before I send it in. The question I am trying to answer in this paper is what are the functions that opposition parties perform in a hybrid regime? I focus on African cases and therefore contribute to a still limited but growing body of literature on African parties. But I am dealing with opposition parties in hybrid regimes more broadly. These opposition parties have been rather ignored by scholars working on how hybrid regimes work and their democratization prospects. In this presentation, I will first provide a quick overview of my methods. Then I will review two existing frameworks. First, classic party functions identified in Western liberal democracies, and then regime-sustaining functions that anti-system parties can perform. I find that they only partly explain what opposition parties do in hybrid regimes. I will then introduce a new framework that deals with what these opposition parties do, not to sustain the regime, but on the contrary to challenge it. I will then discuss what this means in terms of regime change prospects. The methodology I have used is comparative, qualitative, and inductive. I am comparing 4 opposition parties across 2 countries. I selected 2 African countries considered hybrid regimes, based upon Politifor and Freedom House indices and categorization by country specialists in the literature. Burkina Faso under Blaise Compaoré from 1987 and 2014, and Uganda under Yoweri Museveni from 1986 to present. Though they are both one-party dominant hybrid regimes, important differences exist between the two countries. It includes the salience of ethnic and religious cleavages, the feature of pre-electoral opposition coalitions, and the strength and politicization of civil society. The two regimes also display opposite trajectories. Compaoré's regime in Burkina Faso progressively became less repressive, though not necessarily more democratic, and was toppled by an opposition-led popular insurrection in October 2014. Museveni's regime in Uganda remains entrenched and violent, as illustrated by the country's downgrading to not free by Freedom House in 2019. This case selection also cuts across both linguistic and regional cleavages, contributing to a very small pool of studies using this approach. This allows me to avoid the pitfall of generalizing dynamics found in a handful of rather similar and overstudied cases to the rest of the continent, and it enables me to bring together the Francophone and Anglophone bodies of literature, still very much divided by linguistic and epistemological differences. In each country, I collected data on the activities of 2 opposition parties, one which emerged from a split within the ruling party and one older historical opponent. The parties under study in Burkina Faso are the Union pour le Progrès et le Changement, UPC, which was created following a split from the ruling CDP in 2010, and the Union pour la Renaissance Parti Sankariste, UNPS, a smaller party that draws upon the legacy of the 1980s Sankarist revolution, founded in its current form in 2009, but a result of a series of fusions and splits among Sankarist parties dating back to the early 1990s. In Uganda, the spotlight is on the Forum for Democratic Change, the FDC, founded in 2004 by disgruntled members of Museveni's NRM around the figure of Kizza Besigye, and the Democratic Party, the DP, Uganda's oldest party, founded prior to independence in 1954. Data collection was conducted over an extended period of fieldwork between 2016 and 2018, targeting each country's capital city, Ouagadougou and Kampala, and other selected areas considered opposition strongholds, as you can see on the slides. It consisted chiefly of semi-structured interviews with 146 stakeholders, including party officials and activists, legislators, local councillors, civil society representatives, journalists, and other stakeholders. Interviewees were identified and contacted using targeted and chain sampling methods. I have looked at what opposition parties actually do to engage the regime. For example, they run for elections, they organize protests, they sit in parliament, etc., etc. The combination of these disparate strategies, some of them involving participating in the regime's institutions and others taking the form of sometimes illegal protests, begs the question of how they intersect. Indeed, these approaches can be pitted against one another and lead to divisions. In Uganda, for example, the fact that the opposition is taking part in elections and institutions and at the same time calling for civil disobedience has been used to discredit them. People may use that to say that they are not sincere and argue you either defy or you don't, you cannot defy and cooperate. Analyzing these parties' functions enables us to understand what these various strategies can achieve. I first analyzed whether these opposition parties were able to perform the functions commonly expected from parties in the literature. Because this failed to provide a full picture of what these parties do, I then used an inductive approach to identify a set of 3 functions that opposition parties can perform, specifically in the context of a hybrid regime, highlighting what these parties can achieve for themselves and their stated objective of regime change. The study of party functions has predominantly focused on liberal democratic environments. The literature lists a varying number of functions that political parties can and should perform, with many overlaps but also subtle variations. Based upon Randall and Zwassen's introduction to a special collection on parties' contribution to democratic consolidation published in 2002, I have condensed the most salient functions opposition parties perform in a democracy and necessary for the system's survival as follows. Representation and aggregation of interest refers to the articulation of demands into policy platforms and representing the interests of sections of the population. It is considered key in consolidating democracy as parties who fail to represent the interests of their constituents and address their preoccupations lay the ground for undemocratic takeovers. Integration leads citizens to use accepted mechanisms to express their political views and have an interest in ensuring its perpetuation. Elite recruitment and training is a key party function in democracies where political leaders are identified and groomed by parties. This is normally performed by attracting people with an interest in politics, channeling their ambitions, and accustoming them to democratic processes. Finally, accountability facilitation refers to parties' ability to hold the government accountable to citizens, either in a vertical fashion or in a horizontal manner, when opposition actors draw attention to the government's wrongdoings and provide an alternative option. In line with these classic expectations, most people I interviewed over the course of my fieldwork stated that the role of opposition parties in Uganda and Burkina Faso was or should be to provide alternative policy options, mobilize people around issues, and hold the government to account. Yet, as Randall and Zwassen have argued in another paper of the same collection, overall, parties in African hybrid regimes only partially fulfill such functions. My research on opposition parties in Burkina Faso and Uganda confirms this assessment. For lack of time, I will not go over each of these functions and how much they are performed or not in Burkina Faso and Uganda. In a nutshell, my review led me to conclude that opposition parties in a hybrid regime aim at performing these classic functions and partly do so. However, they are constrained by the very nature of the regime, which restricts their capacity and resources. More significantly, this set of functions derives from the understanding that the regime is democratic and that parties want to sustain it while trying to capture power, which is not the case in a hybrid regime and which makes it difficult for parties to contribute to democratic consolidation in that way. In authoritarian settings, studies on the role of parties have focused largely on ruling parties. Opposition parties have received far less attention from scholars working on non-democratic settings. For single-party, personalistic or military regimes, it is obvious why, but in other types of authoritarian regimes, this is more surprising. One exception is the work of Albrecht, who studied how political opposition contributed to the survival of Mubarak's authoritarian regime in Egypt. His research unintendedly echoes the work conducted over 30 years earlier by Georges Lavaux on the French Communist Party and his argument that this anti-system party actually performed regime-sustaining functions in the French Fifth Republic. I have drawn from their respective work to analyze 3 key functions: legitimation, tribune, and moderation. Legitimation refers to the fact that opposition parties, because they exist and participate, can provide legitimacy to the regime, contributing to upholding its democratic credentials and its acceptance by its citizens and the international community. The tribune function means that anti-system parties provide people with channels or tribunes through which they can voice their dissatisfaction in an orderly fashion, and therefore reduce the probability of a violent uprising against the system. Finally, moderation refers to the provision of an acceptable alternative to the government within the system, reducing the attraction to radical anti-systemic activism. It echoes the integration function observed in democratic settings. It similarly provides citizens opposed to the political system with an alternative within the regime itself rather than outside. This framework of regime-sustaining functions is helpful in understanding how opposition parties in non-democratic settings can inadvertently contribute to the survival of the regime that they oppose. Yet once again, this fails to provide a full picture of what opposition parties can do. In addition, while their existence and participation can have the unintended consequence of sustaining the regime, Museveni's and Compaore's hold on power has been mainly fueled by other variables, such as the control of security forces, a strategic regional position making them agents of stability for the international community, and fairly sizable support among the population's rural majority fueled by patronage. Looking at opposition parties' role solely in terms of how they can contribute to sustaining the regime is a narrow approach, which overlooks the other functions they can perform in such a context. To fully understand the functions of opposition parties in this context, I argue that we need a new analytical framework. This must focus less on how opposition parties help to sustain the regime and more on how they engage with it, accommodate the regime-related constraints, and work toward their stated objectives of regime change. Based upon my research in Burkina Faso and Uganda, I have identified three broad functions that opposition parties can perform within a hybrid regime: the denunciation of the regime, the mobilization of dissent, and the preparation for succession. These functions expand our understanding of the role of opposition parties in this context, complementing rather than replacing existing frameworks. Denunciation can be considered a limited version of a horizontal accountability facilitation, in a context where the government is de facto not accountable to its citizens. The function of denunciation is performed quite well by all opposition parties dealt with in this paper, by boycotting elections, through campaign rallies and protest marches, or during parliamentary debates. It plays out domestically but also internationally. Foreign partners notice opposition boycotts and the repression of rallies and marches, and opposition leaders have also taken to travel abroad and lobby foreign stakeholders themselves. A second function opposition parties may perform in hybrid regimes such as Burkina Faso and Uganda is to mobilize support around their criticism of the regime. Contrary to existing understanding of this mobilization function, this doesn't focus on electoral mobilization. In a hybrid regime, this mobilization does not contribute to integrating people into the system, but on the contrary to fuel dissent and keep a certain level of pressure on the regime. According to activists in both countries, this involves sensitizing people around their rights and their own role in the struggle. The mobilization capacity of opposition parties depends on their individual spread and resources, as local branches, activist networks, and money are all important components of any mobilization strategy. Mobilization is also enhanced by inter-party collaboration and coordination with other actors such as civil society organizations, trade unions, and in Uganda, independent politicians. Succession refers to the preparation of an alternative by opposition parties, ready to take over after the fall of the current regime. It is related to both elite training and opposition moderation. Because of the existing constraints that they face, opposition parties may not be able to successfully topple the dictatorship despite their efforts at denouncing the regime and mobilizing against it. However, they can still prepare themselves to take over when the opportunity arises. This function is partly performed by taking part in the state's institutions, such as sitting in parliament or local councils. This is also performed through the building of the party as an organization, the development of a supporters base, and the design of policy proposals. Finally, appearing as a committed opposition to the regime in parliament or in the streets and arousing popular support places the opposition as parties or as individuals in a good position to claim legitimacy after the regime's fall. Contrary to the frameworks applied earlier, this set of functions relates not to how opposition parties contribute to sustaining the regime, willingly or not, but on the contrary to how they can carve a political space for dissent within the system and ultimately push for regime change. The three functions discussed, denunciation of the regime, the mobilization of dissent, and the preparation for succession, can contribute to regime change and democratization over time if they are performed successfully. By denouncing the regime, opposition parties can weaken both voters' support for the government and international credentials it may have, while making it more difficult for the government to rig elections to stay in power. By mobilizing dissent, they maintain a level of pressure on the regime and may, under the right circumstances, produce opportunities for regime change. Finally, by preparing themselves for succeeding the regime, they can appear as a more credible government in waiting in the eyes of citizens and foreign partners, and allow for a smoother civilian transition if and when a regime change is possible. These functions can also be performed within the status quo of hybrid regimes in order to remain relevant. The comparison between Burkina Faso under Compaoré and Uganda under Museveni is particularly interesting here. Compaoré's regime was toppled by a popular insurrection in October 2014 after attempting to modify the constitution's provision of term limits. Meanwhile, Museveni has so far managed to stay in power in Uganda and recently removed the age limit included in the constitution without much problem, despite opposition parties leading protests and increasing mobilization around the figure of Bobi Wine. I haven't had too much time to describe how opposition parties really perform these functions. In a nutshell, they can all be performed by participating into the system and by protesting against it. Whereas participation and protest sometimes appear contradictory and counter-effective, such as in Uganda as I mentioned earlier, they are in fact complementary. In order to adapt to a shifting environment, opposition parties must combine and mix boycott and participation, protest and party building to engage the regime, just like the ruling elite mixes hard and soft strategies to remain in power. This partly explains why an insurrection could take place in Burkina Faso and not yet in Uganda. In Uganda, the conflict between participation and protest has not been resolved, but on the contrary has led to internal divisions within the opposition and within parties themselves. Yet the 2014 insurrection in Burkina Faso illustrates how protest and participation can intersect positively and pose a real challenge to the regime. By sitting in the legislature, opposition MPs were able to monitor and report on the government's moves, and to use their resources to mobilize outside parliament by other means, including protest and civil disobedience, in alliance with other stakeholders within civil society, and to appear as a credible alternative. This new framework enables us to understand the role of opposition parties in the context of hybrid regimes. In the worst of times, they may be powerless to do more than piss off the regime, as a local official in Burkina Faso stated. In other cases, they might keep the dream alive, in the words of a DP MP in Uganda. On better days, as another Burkinabe local official argued, they can be the engine pulling the wagons of a popular insurrection toppling the regime. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found this presentation interesting. If you have any questions or feedback, don't hesitate to send me an email at the address on the screen or to use the conference facilities. Thank you.